Humanity Matters.
Hello, my name is Adi. I'm the hostess for today's episode of Doing Good, Doing Evil, Part 1 on HMTV. With me today is my father, Professor Kenneth Bigel, a professor of finance and business ethics at Touro University. Hi, Abba.
Hi, Adi. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Okay, so let's get in. I understood that you wanted to address something which was referenced in an earlier episode of this podcast, and I'm just going to give you the floor for that.
Okay, great. So last time when we were talking about disrupting hate, I mentioned that with respect to the terrible events regarding the Bibas family, everybody will remember the Bibas family was murdered, the mother and the two redheaded small boys. The father was returned. I mentioned to my dismay that no world leader had expressed any sympathy for the plight of the Bibas family, and I thought that was a shame. After the podcast was recorded, I learned that the president of Argentina, Javier Milei, declared a day of mourning for the country of Argentina, which I think is really notable and very, very important for us to be aware of. It was a great thing that he did, and he deserves credit for it. So, if we're talking about hatred, if we're talking today about doing good and doing evil, what he did was certainly good. Definitely good.
Yeah, for sure. So now that we've kind of broached
gotten
the topic
that out of
and
the
gotten
way.
that out of the way, what is the relationship between Jewish culture, biblical ethics, business, everything?
Okay, so what puts that all together, especially where I'm concerned, where my own sort of personality development is concerned, I've always been interested in ethics. The business is a social science, and I would submit that it is an activity that is moral in nature because at its core, people relate to one another in the business context. They do things for each other or sometimes against each other in a competitive marketplace. And so whenever you have two people interacting, there's always the risk or the chance that somebody's going to do something wrong, whatever that means to do something wrong. So business is a moral enterprise. And Judaism talks a great deal. I don't think people recognize enough that Judaism also at its core is not just a religion of ritual, but is also a religion of morality and virtues. Right. And we hopefully will talk a lot about that in the next few moments.
Yeah. Speaking of that, it reminds me of, I had a very thorough Jewish education, as you know. It reminds me of, I think I was in middle school when I learned and memorized the 613 mitzvot. Not that I remember them today, but
be a pretty good trick if you can recite all 613.
Yeah, but we learned them as majority of the mitzvot are actions. Either you do this or you don't do this, right? You do respect your parents. You don't steal, and it is very much a moral of this is good and this is bad. So, kind of reiterates your point.
Yeah, it does. The funny thing about the 613, first of all, let's step back a moment and figure out how we get to the number 613. It was agreed upon in the Talmudic era, in the early Talmudic era, that the Bible contains 613 mitzvot, commandments. The basis for that is the following. There are different theories about it, but the most popular theory about the 613 is that if you count the letters, the numerological equivalent of the letters of the Hebrew word Torah comes out to 611. If you add the two first commandments, the first commandment is, I am the Lord your God. Second commandment is, you shall have no other God before you. Those two commandments were heard by the Jewish people in assembly at Mount Sinai. They were heard but quite literally from God's own tongue. Right. The other 8 commandments were spoken by Moses to the people. They didn't hear God's voice. So you take those 2 plus 611, and you get 613. And so over the centuries, there have been different Jewish scholars that tried to come up with, or succeeded in coming up with, a list of what the 613 are. They didn't all agree. The first person that did that was a man in around the 10th century, maybe 11th century, named Saadia Gaon. And then it was done later. These are the most famous ones. And then it was done later by Moses Maimonides. That might be the most famous of the counting of the 613. He categorized the 613 according to topics. And then later, even later than that, in the book of what's called the Sefer HaChinuch, Book of Education, nobody's really certain who did that. It's usually attributed to a man named Rav Aharon Halevi, Aaron the Levite, who was from Barcelona. He listed the 613 in the order in which they occur in the Pentateuch. So we don't necessarily agree as to what the 613 are constituted, how they are constituted. And there were others also that came up with the list. But the important thing is for us to understand that it's a list of do's and don'ts, much of which doesn't pertain anymore in this day because there's no temple. A lot of it has to do with the temple. A lot of the commandments have to do with laws that pertain if you live in Israel. Right. So that leaves something like, I don't know what the exact count is, but that leaves something like 250 that are actually relevant for today. Yeah. But there's a really astounding comment that's made in the book of Deuteronomy by Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our rabbi, our teacher, which I find really astounding and very informative at the same time. He says that this is in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verse 18. He says that you shall do, this is just a translation, you shall do what is fair and good. Fair and good. The word fair is hayashar. So it says, do the hayashar v'hatov, the fair, the straight, and the good in the eyes of the Lord. What's interesting is about this statement is that this comes after Moses had informed the people before his death. They're standing in the desert. They haven't entered Israel yet. Moses knows that he's going to die soon. I think the people also know that he's on his last legs. And he's not really on his last legs because they say he was very healthy. The Bible at the end says he was very healthy, but he was about to pass away. He knew that. And he recited a litany of about 200 commandments in the first half or so of the book of Deuteronomy. And after commanding the Jews, the Israelites, the children of Israel, to do this and that and many, many other things, he comes up with this statement that after all that, you have to do hayashar v'hatov. That's very strange, right? And so Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki of Provence, France, of the 11th century, said that hayashar v'hatov means that you have to go beyond the letter of the law. This is what you're supposed to do. Lifnim mishurat hadin. You're commanded to do this and that and other things, but there are going to be times when you have to go beyond. That's one interpretation of why Moses says this. But I like there's another interpretation which I like more. Okay, let's hear it. And here we go. And that's by Nachmanides, otherwise known as Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, known by the acronym as Ramban. Mm-hmm. He says something which I'd like to read to you. The intent of this being the statement of hayashar v'hatov, the fair and the good, the straight and the good, is as follows. At first, Moses stated that you were to keep his statutes and his testimonies, which he commanded you, which he with a capital H, which God commanded you. And now he is stating that even where he has not commanded you, give thought as well to do what is good and right in his eyes, for he loves the good and the right. Now, this is a great principle, for it is impossible to mention in the Torah all aspects of man's conduct with his neighbors and friends and all his various transactions. Remember, I'm thinking also as a business professor, I'm thinking about these things in a business context, in a social context. It is impossible to mention in the Torah all aspects of man's conduct with his neighbors and friends and all his various transactions as the ordinances of all societies and countries. So we're commanded to do certain things, not to do certain other things, but at the same time, we're supposed to know what's straight and what's fair and what's good.
Right.
Where does that come from?
Good question.
Right? It's a good question, right? It comes from our native intelligence. It comes from the fact that God made us in his image.
Right.
And so somehow we're supposed to know about these things.
A moral compass, I guess.
Yeah, a moral compass, common sense. It reminds me very much, and I made mention of him in the Disrupting Hate podcast. One of the great philosophers of the 18th and 19th centuries, Immanuel Kant, said that there are things that we're supposed to know are categorically imperative, things that you must do, other things that you're prohibited from doing. And he listed lots of things. But how do we know these things? We're supposed to know because we're people.
Right.
We're supposed to know. A baby knows, animals know that you just don't do certain things.
Right.
And so at its core, Judaism is a social science that addresses our interactions with one another on a very, very deep moral level. And this is important to me because Judaism all too often is thought of as a religion of laws,
Right.
Which it is in part, but not in whole. In fact, the word Torah is translated into English as the law. And that's because of an error in the Greek translation where Torah was translated as pneumos, which means the law. But as you know, I know you know this really well, the word Torah doesn't mean the law,
Right.
it means teaching, right? It comes from the word to teach and to learn, right? A teacher is a moreh, and a rabbi teaches Torah. These are things that need to be taught. It's not, and so they're moral principles. It goes beyond the law. So Judaism is not just a religion of law; it's a religion of morality.
That's how we were taught it in school.
That's right, and I'm
Teachings.
glad it stuck.
Yeah. Well, I am also glad. I definitely appreciate everything that Judaism had to offer, especially in the moral sense. So you mentioned Immanuel Kant, but also in your last podcast here, you mentioned a chapter from the book of Psalms and Anton Chekhov.
Right.
How does that play into what we're talking about?
Okay, that's great. So last time I mentioned a verse from the book of Psalms where it says, Sur mira va'aseh tov, avoid evil and do good. Right? So that is a message to us handed down from King David himself as to how to run your life. Right. And the short story, Gooseberries, from Anton Chekhov, just to repeat what I said the last time, has to do with weighing the value of extrinsic rewards versus intrinsic rewards. And the crescendo of that story, which I didn't mention last time, is the narrator of the story, who's the more accomplished of the two brothers, but not as wealthy as the other brother, says at the end, the whole purpose, and I'm just paraphrasing, but the whole purpose of life is, and then he says, quote unquote, exact two words that the psalmist says, he says, do good. And, that's what life is all about. Aseh tov, just like the psalmist, King David said, Sur mira va'aseh tov, avoid evil and do good. Those two words. And that's what life is about. Doing good is in itself the greatest reward. It's not always easy.
Yeah.
Because we are, after all, selfish people. We live for ourselves, right? And we're admonished, by the way, interestingly. I can't tell you what was going on 2,000 years ago. I wasn't around. But the most prominent thinker 2,000 years ago was a man named Hillel. And it's my sense that he was responding to something that was in the air in the Jewish community in Israel at the time that he spoke. This was just before, he lived about a century approximately before the destruction of the Second Temple. And so he's quoted in the Mishnah in a book known popularly as Ethics of the Fathers, Avot in Hebrew, chapter 1, verse 14. He says, if I am not for myself, who am I? Who will be for me? If I am not for myself, who will be for me? And that's interesting. It seems like he's responding to something that might have been in the air about that you have to do good all the time.
Right.
And he's telling you, don't be a goody two-shoes all the time. You have to look out for yourself. Right. You have to take care of yourself, because if you don't, nobody's going to take care of things for you.
Right. But then why do good at all?
So then why do good at all?
What is the point of doing good?
The point of doing good is doing good is rewarding intrinsically. And of course, in our faith, doing good also has the implications that if you do good and you observe God's commandments, both those things, you'll be rewarded in the world to come. Right, but let's not forget the rest of the verse in Ethics of the Fathers, Hillel's famous verse. If not for myself, who will be for me? And then he goes on, if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? Right. So he's saying, you have to look out for yourself. You have to do good, but first look out for yourself. And the way I see it is, if you don't look out for yourself, then you're not going to be wealthy enough. I don't mean that in a monetary sense, but prosperous enough, strong enough, healthy enough to do good. Yeah. Right? And so in a future podcast, I hope to talk about charity and do some comparisons about different ways of viewing charity.
Right. That could be in part 2.
That could be in part 3, maybe. We'll see.
Maybe.
Okay.
Thank you for having me, Abba.
Okay.
Thank you for HMTV. And we hope you tune into the next episode, part 2.
Let me just close. You're a little premature over there for a second. I just want to say a couple of things. A quote from Proverbs. When the righteous increase, the people rejoice, but when the wicked rule, the people groan. Right? So it's good to be good. It's good to be good. It's good to be good. And also, in the book of Genesis, God points out the following, chapter 6, verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And subsequent to that, God looked at the world, and he saw that it was full of the Hebrew word chamas, bad things. There are many different ways of translating that word. Theft, violence. And he decided to
wipe us.
To wipe out humanity, except for one small family.
Right.
We all know the story.
Pretty important book.
Pretty important one.
Definitely relevant to today, when everybody talks about it online and in person, how nobody's nice anymore. Nobody's just good anymore. So I think that's something people should think about one day.
I mean, look what's going
Definitely
on. Not to get too much into politics, but look what's going on in the world with all the hatred and and the political chasm in the United States.
Yeah.
You know, Anton Scalia, the late great conservative Supreme Court justice, commented that all this conflict and noise that we see is part of the democratic process, and he applauded it. I guess what he was trying to say was that the right thing comes when there's conflict, not violence, but verbal, ideological conflict, discussions about what to do, about right and wrong, legal issues, and hopefully in that process, the right thing will be decided upon. Yeah. And I suppose that's the great American experiment that we are
all a part of at this very moment.
That we're all a part of as we live and breathe, right? And have been for nearly 250 years. Yeah. And it's been like no other place in the history of mankind.
That's definitely something to think about.
Yeah.
There's a comedian who also passed away some 20 or I don't even know how long ago, but George Carlin, who spoke very, very much about all of the topics that are very relevant today, way before they became relevant in the late 90s. And that's another person I think everybody should look and watch at least one of his specials. He does a fantastic job.
You just have to delete some of the language that he uses here and there. Right. Don't watch it in front of the kids.
Yeah, probably not, but it's still relevant and profound, honestly, for a comedian.
Yeah.
Okay, now I will wrap it up.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Dad. Thank you, Abba.
Thank you, Adi.
And thank you, HMTV. And we hope you tune in for the next episode, part 2 of Doing Good and Doing Evil.